Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. A very, very warm welcome to our session, which is actually a panel discussion on issues of vaccine policy and health equity. And I think that is, for clear, one of the major issues and lessons to learn from the COVID-19 situation. In my personal opinion, I think many people will share that idea, is that research and development for vaccines in the COVID-19 crisis was an unprecedented event. It was such a quick response that within less than a year, vaccines were available, and it wasn't one, it was two, and later 3 and 4. So this was clearly something which was at highest speed. I also think that at least in many countries, deployment, production first, and then also deployment worked. But obviously, this is not a matter of equal deployment, but rather a focus on the high and middle-income countries. And this is the issue which I think we face and want to discuss today. That is, how do we get vaccines and, in general, intervention measures to everybody? I think we have an outstanding group of panelists, and we have a few small changes which I would like to announce. Our first presentation will be from CEPI, and the title remains, it's Lessons Learned from COVID. And the conclusion is also in the title, Science is Our Best Defense Against Pandemics. And we have here Samia Saad, the expert actually on such issues. She is now Director of Resource Mobilization and Investor Relations at CEPI. Took over this, if I'm right, in 2020. And before, she was already involved in the building up of CEPI on behalf of the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. And that is where she spent the last couple of years before she came to CEPI. She studied at the London School of Economics, and that is now what she's mostly based on in her working. But before, actually, she did cell biology, and I found out she did work on a topic I didn't know that before. That is very similar to what I'm interested in. That's cell differentiation, and so she has a very broad overview on both the biology and also on the kind of resource mobilization for vaccines. Our next speaker is virtual, and that's Peter Hotez. He will focus on vaccine diplomacy in a time of anti-science. I think that's an important issue. Hello, Peter, I see you on the screen. It's an important issue, notably for high-income countries, as I personally see it, and it is probably one of the reasons that the vaccine coverage in countries or states like United States or Germany have not reached the level some of us or everybody here probably would like to see. Our next speaker then will be Jayashree Iyer, again virtual. Hello, again also to you. And she is from the Access to Medicine Foundation and will talk about improving best practices to ensure health equity. And finally, we have here a person of politics, His Excellency Dr. Alfredo Borrero from the Republic of Ecuador. And believe it or not, Ecuador and Germany have about the same vaccine coverage, and they're clearly countries of different status. And he will talk and tell us, I guess, some personal experiences, how a global pact for equity on vaccination can work. So we will start with the first presenter, and he is here, obviously, sitting to my left, to your right. So to start immediately with the first presentation, That's Samir Saad, and I already gave you the title. And since this was just a minute ago, I won't repeat it. And I would like to ask you to present your major points for the discussion. Before you start, let me just have one or two comments. So we have short presentations first to set the stage, more or less, of what we want to discuss and talk. Afterwards, after each talk, you have the opportunity to ask a burning question that is directed to the presentation, mostly because something wasn't clear enough for you or someone in the audience. Otherwise, we will then have the main discussion at the end of the session, and I hope it will be as lively as possible and obviously also as informative as possible. If you have questions from outside, from the virtual world, I understand that the majority of you, the audience, is not sitting in this room, but is sitting at home or office somewhere else on this globe. And then I will get these questions or comments on the tablet here, and I will then see how I can integrate that into the discussion. And obviously, for you in the room, please use the microphone, not only that I understand it here, but also that the whole audience, the virtual audience, will understand it. Now, after this kind of technical issues, now finally, Samia, I would be happy to start.
Thank you very much. Thank you for having me, and it's great to have the different perspectives from the wealth of experience of the different panelists. So I'm going to start at the very beginning, I guess, which is, without any tools to fight a pandemic, you're nowhere, and really the best exit strategy when you have a fast-moving global pandemic is vaccines, diagnostics, and therapeutics. And CEPI really was founded in early 2017 as a result of the fact that after the West Africa Ebola crisis, because there was seen to be fragmentation, but also no incentive to work on specific high-risk pathogens that predominantly affected low-resource settings. So CEPI is a global partnership. It's a coalition. The vision is that epidemics and pandemics are no longer a threat or reduced threat to humanity. And our mission is really to accelerate vaccine development and biologics against epidemic and pandemic threats, including what we call pathogen X, the unknown pathogen. And unfortunately, pathogen X came in the form of COVID. We could have predicted it was going to be a coronavirus, but it came very quickly. This just illustrates that we are a coalition, and all of these different stakeholders are key to making science work in terms of a tool to fight and prepare to fight pandemics. One thing I think that probably everybody knows is sort of the path to sort of the R&D path for developing tools such as vaccines. But what was originally thought as key is that public sector financing funds the upstream research, so the discovery, early academic research, and then public sector funding comes in at the procurement phases. But actually, in the case of a pandemic or even endemic high-risk pathogens that cause irregular outbreaks, there is market failure. So there is no incentive for that middle piece of technology development to happen. And that's why CEPI, there was a recognition that there was a need for a pooled mechanism to sort of coordinate and really be agile and science-driven to move the science and technology platforms, accelerate them forward. So CEPI sits really in that middle bit of the value chain. What's been most remarkable about the science in COVID is it is the fastest fastest and most rapid development of a vaccine. The previous record was held by measles, which I think was about 4 years, and that was in the late 50s, early 60s. So it is a remarkable feat, and actually we were lucky. We were lucky that the spike protein was stable and a good target for the vaccines. We don't know if we're going to be so lucky with the next outbreak. But where does equity come into what CEPI does? This stopped working. The equity piece maybe is that as part of our R&D investments that we make, we have global access agreements. So as part of our COVID investments and all the other vaccines that we're accelerating development for, we negotiate terms that include that access, especially for low middle income countries, but also the profile of the vaccines that we invest in, that they can be delivered in low income settings. So really early on in the R&D investment decision process, that is kind of foremost. And for COVID, what was really important, the 3 key elements were speed, scale, and access. So those were the conditions in terms of that drove sort of the investments, and that was really important. And in fact, we were one of the founding partners alongside Gavi, the WHO, and UNICEF of COVAX, the vaccine pillar of the ACT accelerator. And with our R&D investments, we managed to sort of secure first right of refusal to over 1.2 billion doses for COVAX before COVAX even existed, right? So the idea of equity was already embedded in the early R&D with the theme of leaving nobody behind. So that's kind of a little bit of the CEPI journey and how we've used science and science investments to sort of move the early agenda on equity needs to be driven as early as the scientific investments up front, and that's sort of an illustration. Just to say that we're embarking on our next, CEPI is only 5 years old, which is quite remarkable, or will be 5 years old in January 2022. We are embarking on our next 5-year plan. You can. I'm not going to read the slide in terms of what we would like to do, but again, science for equity is also about having a vision that we actually save lives quicker, right? And we prevent loss of livelihoods and economic crisis, the rollback of all the development goals because people aren't accessing health services. We try to really move much more quickly. And I'll end with this slide because it is what our next 5-year strategy has as an anchor, which is really the vision that given the current technology advancements we've had, the proof of concept with a lot of new technologies like RNA vaccines or vector-based vaccines, et cetera, with some of the pathways in terms of regulatory clinical trial platforms, all the things that we can learn from the COVID research science response, we think it's doable to be able to condense the response from, I think it was over 300 days, 314 days from the time we knew the sequence of a SARS-CoV, this new unknown pathogen sequence, to when the first vaccine showed that it could generate an immune response, an effective immune response, that we should be able to condense that through collective global effort from 300 days to 100 days. That would have, in COVID, that could have had, if you look at the figures, could have had such a dramatic impact on lives saved, livelihoods saved, and prevented all the global catastrophe that we've seen over the last 18 months. So that is our mission. We think the science can do it with the new tools that we have, with the political will that is the other thing. This needs financing as well. But always thinking through the equity dimension as early as the R&D and the science. And I'll stop there.
Thank you. Thank you so much. This gave us a whole lot of information already for later discussions. And I would already like to ask a number of questions and comments, but I leave it for later. Is there any, I have a little bit of problem of looking around, but I don't see any kind of hand raising. So it's all clear in principle and ready for a more intensive discussion at a later time point. The next speaker is Professor Peter Hotez from Baylor College of Medicine. He's the Dean of the National School of Tropical Medicine. He's Professor for Pediatrics and Molecular Virology, Microbiology at Baylor. And to me, he is the expert on neglected tropical diseases, NTDs, but of course also a vaccine specialist. And today's talk is actually focused on a time of anti-science that is includes, I would say, vaccine hesitancy, although it's not so clear to me whether vaccine hesitancy or anti-vaxxers is really against science, but Peter will help us to understand that better. And with this, the stage, Peter, is yours. Thank you for joining from the US.
Thank you, Professor Kaufman. I'm very sorry I'm not in Berlin. I'm sure it's a lovely time to be in Berlin this time of year. I'm going to say a few things which not only run counter, but are somewhat unique in my personal viewpoints on how things are going, both with COVID-19 vaccine rollout and the fact that we have this new problem of anti-science aggression. Just a word of who I am. I'm a vaccine scientist. I'm an MD PhD vaccine scientist who's been primarily focused on developing vaccines for parasitic infections, schistosomiasis and Chagas disease. And then about 10 years ago, our group, which is called the Texas Children's Center for Vaccine Development, based at Texas Children's Hospital, Baylor College of Medicine, it's co-headed by myself and my science partner for the last 20 years, Mary Elena Bottazzi. We actually worked with the New York Blood Center and adopted a coronavirus vaccine program because coronavirus vaccines were orphaned just like parasitic disease vaccines. And our work showed that the spike protein is the target of the virus, how to scale up delivery of the spike protein, how to induce virus neutralizing antibodies. And so when the COVID-19 sequence hit, we were able to pivot and develop a very interesting COVID-19 vaccine that I hope will be released soon for emergency use in India and Indonesia as a low-cost kind of people's vaccine for COVID-19. The problem that I see is this in terms of why the Southern Hemisphere is, for all practical purposes, unvaccinated. I think there was a lack of appreciation of the scope of the problem and how far we could get with all brand new technology. So, at the bottom, here's the task, right? 1.1 billion people in sub-Saharan Africa, 650 million people in Latin America, 500 million to 1 billion people in the smaller low-income countries of Asia. And, we need 6 billion doses of vaccines, arguably 9 billion doses of vaccines, and we need it now. We don't need it by 2023 or 2024. And my premise is that, I think, we heard from CEPI and Operation Warp Speed in the US government had the same strategy. There was a lot of emphasis on speed and innovation, and I love speed and innovation, and I'm an MD PhD scientist. We also have an mRNA program and other programs like that. But the problem is, by the exclusive reliance on speed and innovation, as any engineer will tell you, whenever you have a brand new technology, there's a learning curve before you can go from 0 to 6 billion. We simply cannot go from 0 to 6 billion with mRNA and adenovirus vectored vaccines. So we said, look, it's great. The innovation's proceeding. We'll get the mRNA vaccines out, adenovirus vectored vaccines out, but let's balance the portfolio with some old school vaccines that we know we could scale up now. And that's what we've done. We've developed a recombinant protein vaccine. It's the receptor binding domain on aluminum hydroxide with the TLR9 agonist, a CPG from the Dynavax Corporation. And it's been highly effective in non-human primates. The virus neutralizing antibodies now in phase 3 trials and T-cell responses look terrific. And what we did is we do not file patents. We do the tech transfer by providing the production cell bank of the yeast construct to Biological E and Biopharma. Now we're in discussion with a couple of other organizations. Then we help them with the co-development. We help them with the assays and everything else. And we have to do this by raising money privately here in Texas and in the United States. So this was one of the real struggles early on. We had to raise $7 billion for our vaccine. And now Corbevax, the construct in India, is being scaled up to 100 million doses a month in the hope it'll be released for emergency use with an advanced purchase of 300 million doses from the Indian government. And now we're, continuing our Texas vaccine diplomacy with multiple other Asian and African countries who are desperate for a vaccine. They know the other vaccines aren't coming, and so we're helping them when we feel they're capable of scale-up production, as they say, with no patents and no strings attached and really no money. We're doing this to try to get the world vaccinated as quickly as possible. The other piece to this is I'm a vaccine scientist, but I also have a daughter with autism. My oldest daughter, Rachel, has autism and intellectual disabilities. And a few years back, I wrote a book called Vaccines Did Not Cause Rachel's Autism, which made me target number one from anti-vaccine groups in Europe and in the United States because they asserted vaccines cause autism. And in this latest book I talk about anti-science as part of a spectrum of social and physical determinants that are bringing back disease, despite the tremendous successes over the last 20 years of international organizations. And I speak very favorably about CEPI and how important CEPI is to the world in the Gavi Alliance, but also we are seeing these unravelings because of the social and physical determinants. The anti-vaccine, anti-science ecosystem is a bit different in the United States compared to Europe. The version 1.0 started more or less the same, claiming that vaccines cause autism. I think the game changer in the US was the politicization. It started around 2015 under this banner of health freedom, medical freedom. It aligned itself to political extremism on the right, and that's still with us today. And now we're starting to see this globalize. So just very quickly, Professor Kaufman, just to kind of summarize where we're at with version 1.0, 2.0, 3.0. 1.0, there was always these moving goalposts. The anti-vaccine groups would switch up what the actual assertion was. First, they said it was MMR, and then the scientific community, measles, mumps, rubella, the scientific community did heroic work showing that there was no evidence that kids who got the MMR vaccine were at greater risk of being on the autism spectrum. Then they kept on moving the goalposts. Then they said, okay, not MMR, but thimerosal preservative or spacing vaccines too close together, or alum. And they even switched it up around the HPV vaccine. They said it caused infertility and autoimmunity. And if that sounds familiar with the fake assertions around COVID-19 vaccine, this is what they did. They copy-pasted their fake assertion on HPV and put it onto COVID-19. And, I got involved because of Rachel. I have 4 adult kids, but Rachel has autism and intellectual disabilities. And I wrote this book to go into a deep dive, explaining why there's no link, but also what autism is. And we talk about doing whole exome sequencing on Rachel and my wife Ann and I, and we were able to identify an autism gene, which is involved in neuronal communication, similar to the 100 others discovered at the Broad Institute at Harvard, MIT, and other groups. And that's when the aggression really started. And so I have a new nickname now. They call me the OG villain, the original gangster villain. So Professor Kaufman, you've invited the original gangster villain to this panel today. But the experience was very useful because by default, I became an expert in going up against anti-vaccine groups and were able to track their activities. And so around 2015, because they were losing steam around autism, they took on this political mantle of health freedom, medical freedom, and it started in Southern California when the California legislature shut down vaccine exemptions. And then to survive, they linked on to the far right, especially the Republican Tea Party, and it really amplified here in Texas. to now we have over 70,000 kids denied access to their vaccines, especially in the Austin area and some up in North Texas. And this is what we're dealing with today. If you look at the maps of COVID vaccinations, it's very much along a political divide, very much along a Republican-Democrat political divide. And this is the hardest thing for, at least in my career, I've ever had to talk about, because all of our training as scientists, right, is we do not talk about Republicans and Democrats and liberals and conservatives. But I haven't found a way to talk about it other than to talk about it. And unfortunately now it's globalized, using the same health freedom rhetoric and European and capitals and in Canada, and the New York Times and BBC have reported its links to QAnon and political extremism on the far right. So it's taken a very dark turn. So then I'll stop here. This is the three-headed monster that we're dealing with now as a globalized anti-vaccine movement, the far right extremism and political action committees in the US, now the Center for Countering Digital Hate. And it's incredible. We have to have something called the Center for Countering Digital Hate. Has identified about a dozen non-governmental groups they call the Disinformation Dozen that has 60 million followers. And surprisingly, what's coming to light is, and this is coming out of US and British intelligence, the Russian government, the Putin propaganda machine, has been using anti-vaccine, anti-science language as a wedge issue to divide the United States and some of the Western European countries in what's being termed now weaponized health communication. So I think the problem is, if we're really going to take this on, we have to recognize it's a threat. We've had 100,000 Americans lose their lives this summer from the Delta variant. Even though vaccines were widely available, it was out of defiance in the southern United States because of the conservative news outlets and members of Congress telling them not to get vaccinated. And this is a killer, and I would argue anti-science is now a greater killer in the United States than things that we put up a lot of infrastructure to combat, like global terrorism or nuclear proliferation or cyber attacks. Anti-science aggression kills more Americans than all those things combined. So I'll stop there, and I look forward to our discussion. Thank you.
Thank you, Peter. Thank you. Broad range you covered, actually, from vaccine development. We'll come back to the protein adjuvanted vaccines later, and then to the anti-vaxxers, anti-science. And I would like to come back later, actually, on the kind, is that the identical, or is this kind of different groups that are more anti-authority, or is it anti-science? We will see that. Is there any direct question currently? No, though, thank you. We come to our third speaker, virtual as well. It's Yayasri Iyer from the Access to Medicine Foundation. You work at the interface between global health community, the public, and pharmaceutical industry. You are extremely active in searching and completing change, alterations within the pharmaceutical industry. And you are clearly a great manager and negotiator in public-private partnerships. You did your PhD after studying at Singapore and Johns Hopkins, and you are now the executive director of the Access to Medicine Foundation. And you will talk about improving best practice to ensure health equity. Thank you.
Great. Thank you to everyone for taking the time to listen to all of us speak today. And thank you to the organizers for inviting me. I lead Access Medicine Foundation. So we've been, for about 18 years, been evaluating the progress made by some of the largest pharmaceutical company players in the world on how they've been expanding access to medicines, diagnostics, and vaccines. And our scope is covering what their activities have been in over 100 low and middle income countries. We're independent, and so we use a series of different tools, such as research reports, which also have best practices. We use rankings, scorecards, and we identify and try to solve issues per company by identifying also key opportunities for every single company on how they can improve access. And we also have a change mechanism where we influence change using direct engagement with companies, so often having town halls, within companies, trying to make sure that they understand the different examples that are out there. We use policy briefings to governments, multilateral organizations, donors, and NGOs. And today we also work with over 150 institutional investors. These are investors who invest in the pharmaceutical industry, and they engage with the industry using some of our results, and also with media who use our results to inform and leverage the public on access. Now, equitable access to any pharmaceutical or health product is actually a very complex problem. And I think I wanted to say that it takes a lot of global solidarity, which I think today we do not have enough of. And it depends a lot on the goodwill and of human nature, decent laws and good incentives to help stimulate this. So that we can actually try to solve access for over 2 billion people who today do not have access to basic essential medicines and vaccines in the world today. COVID-19 has pushed this issue into the spotlight, but it does mask the chronic issue and the root of the problem in the case for past and future vaccines. Now, my fellow speakers so far have very well articulated a lot of different issues, and I think we'll also be hearing a lot, both in this discussion and outside on the desperation faced by millions of people in the world. So I'd rather spend my time today talking about some of the change and reforms and examples that are working right now in hopes of amplifying the examples via you, the audience, to more uptakers in the industry, governments, and people. So a few things I think I wanted to bring forward. Firstly, I think equity starts really at the top. In my experience, pharmaceutical company CEOs and heads of state alike must ensure that everything they do is for society and not for the immediate people or shareholders that they represent. When I speak about companies, I think companies are starting to realize that they do need to implement equity in their business, so that when they deal with any single product that is in their pipeline or in the market, it does reach people who need them the most, regardless of where they live or how much they can pay or their ethnicity. And I think nations actually really need to help each other in making sure that there is enough for everyone that needs it. And I often speak with pharmaceutical industry CEOs, and I always try to remind them that the vision of a pharma CEO should be to make sure that everyone who is treatment eligible has access to a drug, or everyone who needs protection with a vaccine that they control should have access. And the work in expanding access should not stop until they achieve that goal as quickly as possible. I think often we speak about ensuring that the most vulnerable, including the poor, women and girls, children, people living in hard to reach areas or in countries that are often left out of access, are not seen as an afterthought or not only getting access via a short-term donation program, but are actually part and parcel of any solution that's brought forward. We've also seen companies speaking a bit more about how they're improving supply and supply chains. Many companies have also come forward at the aftermath of their first involvement in vaccines, in talking about how their products reach people and trying to deal with shortages and stockouts. And as we all know, in the recent years, many countries have reported serious vaccine shortages. There's been multiple disruptions of vaccine production delays, campaigns. Some of the things that Peter spoke about has really influenced also uptake of vaccines. And WHO has estimated more than 150 million measles vaccinations have been missed because of disruption. So how can companies actually help to solve that downstream is, I think, important. For companies, I think it also means being cognizant of the concentration, the concentrated market of developers and producers of vaccines. Today, very few companies are actually truly involved in the vaccine space. And what I mean by involved in the vaccine space is really having the engagement and capacity to cover multiple vaccines for the world. And that's despite strong and increasing global demand. It is extremely concentrated. We have 4 large manufacturers, GlaxoSmithKline, Pfizer, MSD, Sanofi, who control 90% of global vaccine value. And about 5 companies produce 60% of the global volume: Serum Institute of India, GSK, Sanofi, Bharat Biotech, and Hafkin. And so we're starting to see that there's a lot more also manufacturers based in LMICs who are willing and starting to step up in playing a role in enhancing access by getting involved in agreements early and trying to improve the situation. I think 2 things I wanted to cover here. What I think is one of the biggest opportunities for us today is solving gaps in R&D. Gaps in R&D in terms of which infectious diseases do we as innovators, whether we're working in industry or in a biotech company, need to solve are very well described today. There are multiple tools, WHO, Polysecure's research have identified a number of different pathogens that pose a pandemic or serious epidemic risk. In our data, in our recent data of the 2020 Access to Medicine Index, we found 10 out of the 16 pathogens that pose a pandemic or serious epidemic risk as identified had basically no R&D projects in the pipeline when it comes to any of the big pharmaceutical companies. And so much innovation is actually not actually happening or left to smaller players or not at all. And I think this is where CEPI's work has come in and extremely instrumental in solving some of these major issues with programs for chikungunya, with companies like Valvena and Nipah virus, with oral vaccines, working with pact, with Lassa virus, with Oxford and Janssen, and many more. I think the second issue that I wanted to bring forward is that as equity really begins at R&D and begins early, and planning for access really matters. And what I mean by that is innovators, especially when you're talking about companies here, need to look more and more at prioritizing countries with the highest disease burdens while a product is actually in development, setting licensing technology transfer agreements, improving supply chains, both upstream with raw materials and downstream in finished products to ensure that more populations gain fair access. And of course, there's an issue of affordability and ensuring equitable pricing schemes in place. Our data has shown that across medicines and vaccines and diagnostics, about 8 of the 20 largest companies in the world are starting to finally do a consistent access planning. So we are seeing strong signs of change, but we need to make sure that more countries benefit and not only a handful of countries and populations at the end of it. Novartis was one of the first few companies to make sure that all their products will actually go through an access planning system. But in the last index, we found companies like Pfizer, who are today extremely important and in the spotlight for vaccines, are really also doing this. So Pfizer, for example, has a newly launched global pricing and access strategy from a number of years ago. And that stipulates that access planning for all its products begins at least 2 years prior to launch. So there is at least a group that is sitting together trying to understand what's going to happen to this product when we launch it, who are the beneficiaries, and can we try to make sure that it covers more countries. However, its access planning strategy did not apply to COVID-19. And as a company, alongside many other companies last year in the middle of the early part of the pandemic, many companies did not communicate their commitments on vaccines early, even though today, of course, Pfizer has delivered over 1.7 million doses to 140 countries and has really been working on multiple agreements with the COVAX facility and with the US government, and also direct supply chain agreements with country governments itself. And unfortunately, our colleague from Pfizer is not here to present their upcoming commitments, but some of their commitments also includes by the end of 2022 to cover about 1 billion doses of COVID vaccines to low and middle income countries via a variety of mechanisms. But I think what we need to see is more companies really having a system in place where their vaccines have better access planning. But we definitely need to make sure that this is supported by donors. Today, the Wellcome Trust, the Gates Foundation are examples of donors who support access by ensuring that products that are developed with their support must be available globally. And they have contractual terms that feed back into future access. I'm not saying that all of these have to be heavily prescriptive or make people fear innovation or deter innovation, but we have to be definitely bolder in addressing future issues of availability as we're innovating. There are companies who are today who have accepted over 3 billion in taxpayer money in developing some of the COVID vaccines, but they're today the same people who have been paying for that are actually having trouble persuading these companies to ensure as technology is made more available. So I do believe that as a strong supporter of PDPs, CEPI, I think, are an important platform where collaboration and equitable access are part of their mandate, which means that they only work on programs that make a big impact. They take on some of the highest risks and guarantee access where the money has been invested and some of the relationships that are being built. And we need to definitely be supportive of their work with a wider range of companies. I think I wanted to just end by saying I think we've achieved so much with the work of Gavi, UNICEF. We're today in a sort of a turning point with what we've learned with COVID. And I think that vaccines have saved already billions of lives with some of the work that we've done. I can only hope that with some hard work as a society, we'll achieve that with a new vaccine that has been approved now for malaria. But we did not achieve global equity for the beast facing us today, which is COVID and just cost lives. So I do think that I'm looking forward to seeing much more global solidarity and a lot more action taking on this issue. And our data can help by showing some best practices of what works.
Thank you. Thank you. Many questions or comments and ideas came up. Again, I will refrain from immediately asking you, and no direct questions, at least no, also neither virtually nor on site. So we come to our last not least, our last speaker today, and then start with the second part with the discussions. It's His Excellency Dr. Alfredo Borrero Vega. He's Vice President of the Republic of Ecuador, and he's MD. I understand you are surgeon by training, a neurosurgeon, and spinal surgery is your topic. But then you decided to join the current president, His Excellency Guillermo Lasso, as vice president, and as an MD, you put a lot of efforts into getting health systems established, and therefore this is important also that you hold a diploma in health administration, and I think that the Republic of Ecuador is an interesting example how you can push forward vaccination programs rapidly under a more difficult situation than, let's say, in Europe or the US. And this, what you achieved, was not only the vaccination program, but also a highly important, in my opinion, attempt to get equipment, medicines into hospitals suffering from the crisis over the last 1.5 years. So the stage is yours, and I'm interested to see how that problem could be solved. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Kaufman. Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. In April of 2020, Ecuador's second largest city, Guayaquil, the country, the economic capital, made international headlines due to the severity of the pandemic. A combination of COVID and dengue resulted in many people collapsing and dying in the streets. Overcrowded hospitals, citizens struggling to buy medicines without knowing if they will treat COVID-19, and food shortages constituted in a scene of terror. By November of the same year, the rest of the country was living a similar situation. Our health system had collapsed. Today, barely a year after of those events, Ecuador made new headlines again, but because it took us less than 100 days to inoculate 70% of our adult population. We reduced the ECU occupation to 25% and COVID deaths by 90%. There is no secret behind the success of our fight against COVID-19. We properly implemented the following key elements: a strong leadership by our president, a national vaccination program designed by specialists, and a close collaboration with the private sector and the international community. We are very proud that we have achieved it, but unfortunately, our country is an exception. Only 36% of the world's adult population is fully vaccinated against COVID-19. And few countries have managed to vaccinate more than 70% of the adult population. Today, I would like to raise in this forum the vital importance of a global pact for equitable vaccination. Isolated efforts are vain, since we will maximizing our chance of fighting current and future pandemic. We establishing a common global strategy and focusing on our joint efforts. Achieving universal, equitable, fair and timely access to the vaccine against COVID-19 in low-income countries is even more challenging. In addition to vaccine purchasing problems, there are severe supply chain difficulties and unreliable disability system, reflecting the fragility of health system in our countries. According to database from the Global Dashboard for Vaccine Equity, 62% of the population in high-income countries have been inoculated with at least one dose of the COVID-19 vaccine. While in low-income countries have only reached 4% of theirs. Out of the 60.7 billion doses had administered worldwide, only 4% corresponded to low-income countries. Sadly, there are countries in our America that have only reached 16% of the population totally inoculated. Low-income countries have to increase their health care spending by 57% in order to vaccinate 70% of their population, and in the other hand, high-income countries only need an increase of 0.8% in order to reach the same percentage. Economic inequity is stressed by the fact that countries with higher COVID-19 inoculation coverage will have an accelerated economic recovery versus those without advancing inoculation coverage. Let's learn from the tough lessons the COVID-19 pandemic has left upon us and work on a road mapping for a new, fairer healthcare system. The global plan must be science-driven, promote global willingness, and strengthen solidarity. Let us first focus on science. Health science and related technologies have been key instruments to fight the virus, not only because of the unrivaled impulse in the vaccine development, but also for the incorporation of scientific experts in the decision of making process, the use of digital technologies, innovation in biotechnology, the strengthening of public and private partnerships together for the production of medical equipment and supplies, and scientific dissemination with the collaboration of academic and scientific societies. Second, the will of countries to establish a global position against pandemic. And I speak as a vice president of a country that was brought its knees by this COVID-19 pandemic. And I am a doctor too. Governments must act together, pursuing the development of global policies. I mean to guarantee sufficient and timely funding for science, technology, and innovation in healthcare. Only then will be able to offer the basic human right of proper health, recognized in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. Such policies should include prevention and mitigation measures, fast and reliable diagnostic tests, safe, effective, and accessible therapies, modernization of information system. Focus all of this on monitoring and evolution. Finally, this word, solidarity. Solidarity. When we are sick, we become extremely vulnerable. Millions of people sick at the same time made us vulnerable as the humanity. I urge that no border of political views limit our vision of a global health. Your neighborhood disease is your own disease. The distribution of vaccines should be first in place highly affected. In terms of morbidity and mortality, and where new variants appear. Reaching the goal by the World Organization Health, that is 70% of the world's population inoculated by mid-2022, this is possible. But for this to happen, we must ensure the vaccines reach to who need them most, regardless of their socioeconomic, geographic, nationality, or ethnic characteristics. This task is very, very difficult, and we will only achieve it by working all together. I hope that a few years, when we look back of this pandemic situation, we will remember it, not only for the greater contribution of the science, but also as the health emergency, in which global injustice and inequities were overcome. Finally, in the framework of the meetings that I have been able to hold this week, I want to say that we will tirelessly support the initiative of the World Health Organization to create 30 that sets clear rules for the next pandemics. Only in this way will we ensure a fairer and more equal treatment for all countries of the world. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen.
Thank you. Thank you very much. These were a lot of words of hope, how we hopefully will solve the issue. Unfortunately, some of the issues are there. We know and want to solve them, but the question obviously is then how can we solve them best? And perhaps I start now the general discussion. I invite everybody here and in the virtual space to come up with additional comments and questions. May I start with you, Samia? So we all agree there are a lot of vaccines around, I think more than I at least would have envisaged. They are unequally distributed, obviously. And we will focus on COVID-19 first only, and then we come later to the lessons learned for the next pandemic, if that's fine with all of you. So what are the major issues which we have to solve now, not tomorrow, but now really? The research has been solved. Production, in my opinion, works relatively well in the countries which are having the major production sites, Europe, US, and India, and China actually also. But what has to be happened that it comes to those who need it most now?
Thanks, Stefan. I want to pick up actually on a point that Peter made, which is, we were fortunate the science worked quickly, and the major bottleneck was the scaling. And actually, one of the things that CEPI did was invest in a very diversified portfolio of different types of vaccine technologies that could scale to differing amounts, to sort of mitigate the scientific risk, but also to address the scaling issue. I think one of the biggest failures of this pandemic, of the many, was that there wasn't, there's limited capacity. You don't have warm manufacturing bases just sitting around. Some of these new technologies, as Peter said, needed time to learn how to scale, needed time to figure out how you do the technology transfer, to whom, what capacities existed, etc. And so one of the biggest failures was there was very little desire from anybody to fund manufacturing at risk. So had we, right at the beginning, last summer, agreed that we needed some sort of speed premium, that we were willing to take the risk to just, reserve the manufacturing capacity that existed more equitably, so that there was more access for the globe and for those populations that were the most vulnerable all around the globe. But that money didn't materialize, right? That is one of the big pieces, is that we need in the future a system where there's recognition at the outset of an outbreak that you're going to need to put money at risk, not just for the science, but reserve that manufacturing capacity so that access is equitable. And so I think that was one of the biggest pieces. And then the other piece that also CEPI tried to do is diversify the locations of your manufacturing. Because what will tend to happen is if you concentrate your manufacturing in one place, don't put all your eggs in one basket. You need regional capacities, and you need to build those regional capacities. That's very, very clear.
But that, if I may interrupt, or I thought I can now interrupt, is that okay? I mean, but that couldn't be started from scratch within months. I mean, to build a manufacturing capacity that takes, I would say, years actually, and having established it all. My own experience is mostly with Serum Institute, and I know how well they do it. So that would have had to start couple of years earlier. Was that in the original CEPI program, or was that outside of the original CEPI program?
It's outside of,
Yes.
of CEPI's original remit. I think the point here was that there was a known amount of existing capacity.
Yes.
Okay.
And that was
And
fixed.
and then going back to Dr. Alfredo's point about the
Yes.
fair allocation, as part of the ACTE-COVAX vaccine pillar, the WHO group working on a fair allocation mechanism really prioritized, the elements. Where do you need the vaccine? Who's the most vulnerable, etc. And actually, when CEPI and others mapped what capacity there was, it was going to be 20% of each population globally. It was because we thought potentially with the current technologies and manufacturing capacity, you could have 2 billion doses in 2021.
Yeah.
Right? So it was based, the whole setup was based on what existed that you could leverage very quickly in a fair way.
Yeah.
But that capacity needed to be reserved early because it was finite.
Yes.
And alongside that, you're starting to think about the medium term and what you need to do and to build in terms of regional capacities.
So I'm the first to criticize many aspects. At the same time, I feel also that either we were lucky or it was still relatively fast for what was achieved, knowing also that RNA vaccines, in my opinion, are two parts. It's the nanoparticles, which are, in my opinion, rather complex part. And we also hear that there is a vaccine, I don't give names now, in the US, which awaits still licensing. It's a protein adjuvant. Peter, you are going for a protein adjuvant vaccine as well. Is that still state of the art with regard to promptness and quick production of large amounts of vaccines?
Yeah, you see, with nucleic acid vaccines will always be faster on the front end. Same with adenovirus, because you can move pretty quickly to the clinic, and that's where Operation Warp Speed in the U.S. focused their efforts, and they were able to make enough for the United States. But there was never in the United States a consideration of global equity. And with our vaccine, even though it takes a few extra months longer to make the construct, you pick up the speed at the distal end, because then there's no limit to the amount you can scale. Now, with the Novavax vaccine, by the way, it's an excellent vaccine, that Novavax vaccine. The data is really impressive. The problem is it's not a simple recombinant protein. It's a particle. There's more complexity there. And again, it's still a relatively new technology. Our vaccine is the same technology used to make the recombinant hepatitis B vaccine. It's about as straightforward as you can imagine. Receptor binding domain, a small molecule, a relatively small protein, scaled up in yeast and Pichia pastoris, secreted. There's no limit to what you can make. You can make billions and billions of doses with barely breaking into a sweat. And we knew this was the way to go. And the frustration was we could not persuade any of the policymakers, either in the US or globally, to roll the dice with us. So we were on our own. If we had gotten Operation Warp Speed to buy into this, and we think, by the way, it's going to be the least expensive, about $1.50 a dose, so one of the least expensive. If we had been able to do that, in principle, the US government could have worked with Merck and Company, which makes probably one of the largest producers of the hepatitis B vaccine, to make this, or maybe GSK. And I personally think, you can't prove it because it's not, it's just a guess, but I think we could have had the world vaccinated by now if we had that support in the beginning. Now we're moving along. India's moving along. Indonesia's moving along, but we still, because the other problem is it's not just the factories for making new vaccines. it's the human capital, right? Training them to do it under a quality umbrella, quality control, quality assurance. That's the rate limiting step. That's, so if we're going to invest in making vaccines in Africa, more in Latin America, which also underachieves, and Southeast Asia, that's where the investment has to come in, the human capital. You can make all the factories in the world, yes, but it still won't be adequate. With ours, there are lots of countries making their own recombinant hepatitis B vaccine, right? Bangladesh does it, Vietnam does it, Brazil does it, and the list goes on. And that's why we thought ours was pretty solid for plug and play, but we just didn't have that adequate support early on. Now it's sort of starting to move, and I hope we can move quickly.
Yeah, thank you. And I think the world is changing really rapidly. I understand that BioNTech, who's in Germany, we mostly say BioNTech, the US mostly says Pfizer, I guess. Anyway, is now establishing this kind of production line in at least 3 countries on the African continent. So there is a move, but... can
I just make one other point, Stefan, which is that I think we also want to be careful not to dive too headstrong into mRNA. Let me tell you why. At the beginning of this pandemic in 2020, if you had asked me, Peter, what's going to be the vaccine that's going to move fastest on this? What that's going to be successful? And if they also said, and Peter, by the way, you can't say your vaccine, you got to pick another one. I would have said the vesicular stomatitis virus, Ebola vaccine technology developed by American company, right? And what an incredible vaccine, single dose, 90% protection. In DR Congo, stabilized the African continent, extraordinary vaccine.
Yes.
And it tanked, it failed, right? And if you said mRNA, well, I don't know, it's been around for a while, nucleic acids have been around.
I would actually not go too much into technology. We had a workshop already on vaccine techniques and so.
But the point is, when we're making these decisions now about future pandemics, I think it's important not to be like a little child's football game where all the kids run off in one direction after the ball. We really need a true balanced portfolio, because any new pathogen, you never know what's going to be.
Yeah. So I agree. What I would well appreciate it, I would like to come back also. You work also, or you are highly interested in how, let me say that big pharma can be kind of modified in getting into this more. So what would be your suggestion that we get the vaccines even quicker in the next round and as quick as possible in this round of an issue like COVID-19?
Yeah, I think there's still a lot of work being done in this round to try to convince manufacturers to expand their technology and get some of these agreements to reality to fill the gaps in vaccine equity. I think that a lot of things should have been done a lot earlier in the pandemic, right? I mean, most of the innovators, wherever they are, most of the donors who actually help to support this, were looking to support a vaccine to be made as quickly as possible. And there was some talk about equitable access, but primarily a lot of that was actually handled by the COVAX group and the accelerators work on that, and not necessarily in the boardrooms of companies themselves, or definitely not with the shareholders. So one of the things that we tried to do earlier on is try to get over 150 investors to basically appreciate the importance of getting equitable access early on. It took a number of months. My colleague actually called investor company by company to basically convince them that this is the best way to go. And as you can imagine, investors sitting in the UK, in the US, or here in the Netherlands, it was difficult for them to understand, how do I solve the problem globally as an investor when I need to get vaccinated for my people and my population here, and what do I need to support? So I think there were a lot of complexities in terms of what are some of the things that could be done. And as Samia mentioned, I mean, there were so many discussions on excess manufacturing capacity. We may not have been able to bet on which vaccine was going to make it first or best in that sense, but I think that the lack of that enough investment for using that manufacturing capacity has been a chronic issue for a number of years already, and we just couldn't make it in time in that sense. I think from the company's point of view, some of the things that we've been doing, also with multiple stakeholders asking for it, is also try to make sure that companies, apart from some of the things on access planning, to make sure that their future vaccines are more engaged, trying to get them to work more with CEPI and others in HIV vaccines, parasitic vaccines, to work with many different innovators around. Has also been looking at how companies are diversifying their own supply chains itself. So some of the companies, a few months ago, we had a workshop on this. Some of the companies were really struggling with also diversifying the locations of manufacturing for their own products. Sourcing of vials, solvents, nanoparticles, it's complex. It's not always the parent company who's selling the vaccine that actually is in control of all the different components that they need to bring forward. One of the COVID vaccines actually has over 200 components in order to be fully finished for delivery, and that comes from over 19 countries. So it's really important to realize that to make a vaccine, it comes from so many different places, and that sourcing, that sustainable procurement of the right raw materials and the finished products is a challenge. A lot of companies themselves have said that the ones that could step up are the ones who've actually already stepped up on areas like Ebola, for the Ebola vaccines, for pneumococcal vaccines. So I think one of the major issues we're facing as a society now is we have a concentrated group of about 4 or 5 manufacturers, big companies, who actually have the scale and ability to produce, when we have this huge number of manufacturers based in developing countries, many of them who supply today's vaccines for polio, for rotavirus, who can actually help in this. So I think that combination is what we need to look at, and not keep thinking that it's that concentrated group that actually needs to solve the world's problem on its own. I think you need definitely much more innovation. You need a balanced pipeline of different types of technologies, different players stepping in. So we need a much more diverse group of companies stepping on board, and those that are on board need to stay on board. I think many companies are feeling the pinch of, okay, now that we worked on Ebola vaccine, can we actually tackle the next pandemic or an epidemic vaccine in that sense? And I think they need to realize that if they don't, who will?
Yep. Let me ask a question to you, Dr. Borrero, if I may call you that way. What was the reason for choosing the vaccine you used mostly in your country? And because you had this enormous success in getting the vaccine rapidly to the people, which vaccine did you choose and why?
In our countries, when we not produce vaccines,
no, it's working. Okay. Yeah.
We have to record to the countries that produce, and some of these industry close the door or open the door for our countries, or poor and with problems in health. We use first Sinovac, yeah. Sinovac and CanSino we buy 6 million of vaccines, and the other one is Pfizer, AstraZeneca, and we don't have the chance of choosing.
Yes, that was actually the background to my question. So you were more or less forced to get what you can get, more or less, and use what you can get. Is that right? Or
it's right.
So,
if I can speak a little bit more, the problem is not political. The problem is the health, and the problem is in the poor countries.
Yes.
When we don't have a good health system.
Yes.
And the people die in the streets.
Yeah. So this is perhaps again back to you. I see you somehow for COVAX and CEPI. There are a number of vaccines. There is this kind of discussion whether they are all equally effective or not. I will not go into that unless it's needed for vaccine policy. So the choice is you talking about is AstraZeneca. I mean, at COVAX is mostly AstraZeneca and Pfizer, I understand, or?
So actually,
is Sinovac in the program? It's endorsed by.
So the fundamental premise of COVAX is that it needs to have an emergency use license by the WHO.
Yes.
So all the vaccines that currently have an emergency use license are in the portfolio, and some that have shown efficacy and are in the process of getting are also coming into the portfolio. So because we need, I mean, if we're talking about 70% of the global population by next year, we need,
Yes,
you know, like Peter said, we need, we cannot scale any one vaccine to the billions of doses that we need. So we need to diversify, and that's what COVAX has done through its deals that it's cut with industry. And some of the deals were cut obviously before even we knew for 100% sure whether the vaccine was going to work or not, because you needed to do that to secure the sort of the supply.
Well, the COVAX is clearly a wonderful thing once it fully works, but it would also be probably advisable for different countries like Republic of Ecuador to proactively approach producers, and I don't think there isn't any competition in that. No, it is complementary. May I ask you all, and please let me know who wants to answer that, a question that comes from the virtual space, from Transparency International. And there are reports, and I cite, reports of bribes to access both COVID-19 vaccines and vaccine certificates in many countries. They could have long-term effects on the global and also on the national responses and create barriers to access the vaccines for many, including the most vulnerable. So what is being done to ensure more transparent access to COVID-19 vaccines within countries going forward? This question is difficult, but I wanted to have it raised. And is there someone who would think one can answer?
Sami?
We don't represent a country, I guess. Yes. I mean, there are clear, for COVAX, there are clear, you know, we're following the fair sort of allocation mechanism, the eligibility criteria in terms of the LMIC countries that are eligible to get fully funded or with some co-funding required vaccines, etc. So the processes there are clear. There's a publication of what vaccines are going, you know, forecasts of supply, what vaccines are going to which countries, etc. So that is where, I guess, the COVAX partnership starts and stops. Then, you know, what happens at country level is at country level, and clearly we do have UNICEF is the partner that is helping try to get the vaccines delivered as effectively as possible, working with the governments, etc. So the transparency at the level of the centralized level is there. But COVAX is not the only supplier, right? As you said, countries are going directly to manufacturers as well.
So the answer, more or less, is it's a very difficult question. We don't want to have this happen, but it's unfortunately not that it has been solved. And there is no clear-cut strategy.
Other than, I guess,
it is a national
Transparency International are right, that you know, more transparency is going to be helpful. And one thing, let me just pick up another thing on the supply chain challenges maybe that I didn't mention, and I think a couple of the speakers brought up, is part of the challenge has been for the supplies also the upstream raw materials and the supply of those, etc., and where they're concentrated. And then, so COVAX has the COVAX partners have set up what we call a manufacturing marketplace, where we're trying to match make and get more transparency into the system about where are the upstream materials, who needs the, you know, who the vaccine developers, who needs what, etc. So fundamentally, the principle is, yes, we all need a bit more transparency to bring efficiencies, right? Because resources are constrained,
but
and
it
materials
really is
are
on the country level, I understand. Then that,
anyway,
there are two questions actually to you, Dr. Barrero, from attendants from Ecuador. Which is the policy this year for children's vaccines in your country? Accept or not, how much money will be invested in this project?
We start the vaccination to the children 5 to 11 years old, and we have a population around the 2 million of people in this segment of these years. We buy a lot of vaccinated vaccine for this reason, and I know what they have two fronts in the world. Some people say don't vaccinate to the children. Others say yes, we take this way, and we effort in this 1, 2, 3 weeks more to finally to vaccinate 2 million of kids, and then the people can go to the school. This is good, and for the parents is a good thing that they have to send to children to this school because we stayed 1.5 years in the homes.
Yeah, there's actually one more question to you. What was the strategy past that Ecuador implemented so that vaccination reached all its citizens?
We have a population around 70.5 million in Ecuador. Ecuador is a small country, and we hope that in December we take the global vaccination around the 12 million of people, but we continue it now in the vaccination rules to the adults more than 65 years old with other comorbidities, and maybe in the next year we, I hope, I wait into the decision of the Global Organization of Health to if we need the third immunization.
Yeah. Thank you. Actually, time is running more quickly than I thought. So let's come a kind of a final round of 1 or 2 final rounds of comments. And I guess the best is to leave it much open to the panelists. So let me ask, where are we in 2 years with regards to COVID-19? You may say the most optimistic, most pessimistic, or just tell us. And what can we learn from that lesson for the next crisis? Hopefully it will never come up, but unfortunately real life is different sometimes. So what, if I may start again with you, what would you think, where are we in 2 years from now, and what are the major lessons for the future?
Well, I'll start with the science. To say the science is not done for COVID-19. We are still in acute phase. We have first generation vaccines which have not been optimized, whether it's the dosing, whether it's 2 doses versus 1 dose, etc. Whether we need thermostable vaccines, whether we have variant-proof vaccines. So what CEPI is doing, working with partners, is we're already investing in second-generation vaccines because unfortunately we all know COVID is probably going to become endemic, so we move from so that we're ready for that endemic phase. So the science around that is really important. But we're also looking at so variant proofing, second generation vaccines, etc. We're trying to answer some of the questions, scientific questions that are still, how they work in more vulnerable populations, or how can immunocompromised populations. Those are still challenges that haven't been addressed. So we hope in 2 years, those scientific gaps we will have addressed, and we will have a second generation of vaccines that are going to be more easily deployable in low resource settings, etc. And then alongside that, I really hope that there is the political will. The G20 is coming up at the end of this week. Human beings forget quickly, and we really need to learn the lesson and prepare. Yeah. Preparedness is our greatest sort of armament, that we really sort of invest, and don't forget that we need to. You don't. John Nkengasong, who's on our from the Africa CDC, who's on CEPI's board. One of the first things he said, you do not dig a well when the drought happens and you want to drink. You dig the well before. Yes. You do not invest. Every country in the world invests in a fire brigade. Why do we not invest now? And have a coordinated financing mechanism with transparent accountability that looks at what is needed to prepare, but also what is the mechanisms we need to have surge financing so we don't have these manufacturing bottlenecks. And alongside, I hope, my last third point is, I hope that we have agreements at regional level on what capacities are needed, and that there is financing so that those capacity and plans, roadmaps for those capacities to be built. That is the longer term. The shorter term is we really need to sort of get second generation vaccines
notably
and have
also for
a
variants.
financing mechanism for preparedness and response.
I couldn't agree more. I think also we learned for the current epidemics, TB, HIV, malaria, I mean, it needed some wake-up call, and I hope it lasts a little bit longer than a couple
and hopefully
of years.
Also spillover effects for the vaccine development and system writ large for all diseases that are infectious diseases.
So Peter, more or less the same question. Where are we in a few years, 2 years, 3 years? What is the major message for the future from your standpoint?
Yeah, no, I'm very much.
Unfortunately, we have a minute for everybody of you only. Sorry for that. Yeah.
Okay, I'm very much in agreement. I would just qualify a little bit the statement about second generation vaccines. When a few weeks ago, BARDA said to me in the US, Peter, your vaccine looks great, but we don't have money for second generation vaccines. And I said, look, it's not a DARPA project, right? It's not a cutting edge technology. This is an old school technology that we just need to make lots of it. And I think that's going to be absolutely critical. I think the reason we started working on coronavirus vaccines is when we saw SARS emerge in 2002 out of southern China. He said, this is not going to be the last one. Then Middle Eastern respiratory syndrome hit, and he said, this is not going to be the last one. And sure enough, COVID-19 hit, and sure enough, we'll have COVID-26 and COVID-32. So I think, expanding the ecosystem, which clearly is critical. Of course, the multinationals are always going to be in or out. You're never really going to know. We've got to expand the players, and that means right now, as for very few vaccines are made on the African continent. Latin America underachieves terribly, even many parts of Asia. And that's a 5 to 10 year building process to build that human capital. And that's where I think, have to putting in place the investment.
Yeah, agreed. Yeah. So same question. Thank you, Peter. Thank you. Jayashree, what would you please, in a minute, I get these signs already that we are having to finish, yeah?
Yeah, sure. I think some of the major lessons are already well described, also in this conversation, but in others. But companies and governments, I do think, and donors have learned a lot. I think as I echo Peter's comment in expanding the players that are stepping in to innovate and expand access. Companies need to implement better equity, better health equity into their business. And I think governments need to step up to work together to prevent new threats, as Dr. Alfredo speaks up. And I think donors also need to think about how their money is preparing for the future, both looking at short-term and long-term financing, as what Samia has spoken about. I do believe in a couple of years we'll get further in coverage. I'm not optimistic about the pipeline for emerging infectious diseases getting significantly bigger in terms of diversity or size, but we must fight for making that better. But we won't solve the coordination unless we do what Dr. Alfredo was saying ASAP. And at the end of it, we have to strengthen health systems so that more lives are saved, and other drugs that and medical oxygen that COVID-19 patients need to survive, I think, are going to be the things that fill the gap until the vaccine equity issue is solved.
Thank you. And finally, the same question to you, for your country, for the world.
I think
where are we in 2 or 3 years?
I think that the war is not finished. The battle may be. We need to stay together and developing a lot of ways for fighting to the coronavirus and the other virus that is coming in the next years.
Yeah. So that, well, this is as much positive as optimistic as one can be. I see that, of course, we cannot predict which pathogen comes up when and where, but I think we have to change the infrastructure, and that's more or less to be ready to be ready immediately and to combat it. And vaccines play a major role. I think other aspects also play a major role, like surveillance, early surveillance. But that, of course, is never exclusive, and the more, the better. So thank you so much to all of the panel for your informative and thoughtful discussion points. I know we could have gone for a long time, not forever, but for a longer time, but that's how it is. And thank you also to the audience in the virtual space and here in the room, and have a wonderful evening. Thank you.
Thank you.